你好，我叫安迪，我是电脑熊猫，我是美国人，但我的妻子是中国人，她和她的妈妈从山东来，我们住在北卡罗来纳。听不懂？ Did you understand what I just said? I was speaking Mandarin Chinese. Isn't it frustrating when you can't understand what someone's telling you because you don't understand the language? That language barrier shouldn't be a problem. Today, I'm going to tell you a story about how my family overcame that language barrier when I developed a Django app for our small business. So, let's try that introduction again. Hello, everyone. My name is Andy Knight, but Pandy for short. I'm the Automation Panda. I'm a software engineer and test who develops solutions to testing problems. You can follow me on Twitter at Automation Panda, or you can read my blog at automationpanda.com. As you can see, I'm American, but my wife Jessica and her mama are from China.
Hi.
Hi.
Our family runs a small sales business. Jessica used to track all orders in these big, scary spreadsheets, which took a lot of time. So I developed a better solution using the Django web framework. I created data models using the Django ORM for all of the orders and customers. I used the admin site as a front end for us to track the orders. And I uploaded the whole thing to Heroku. I even stored images in Amazon S3. Now, there's just one problem with this application. You see, Jessica's the only bilingual person in our household. I don't speak Chinese, and Mama doesn't really speak English. Day to day, our most common language is Chinglish. So, for all of us to use this application, I had to translate it from English to Mandarin Chinese. Today, I'll demo the app for you briefly, and then I'll show you how I did the translations with Django's framework. Here's the Django application I created for our small business. What's displayed here is the admin site, which I used as the de facto front end for myself, my wife, and her mom. You can see we have data models for customers as well as orders. Let's take a look at the orders. Again, nothing out of the ordinary here. Just the standard view for Django records. We have all the fields, we have actions, filters, titles, breadcrumbs, all the standard stuff. However, I want to draw your attention to the upper right corner here. You can see I've added flag widgets. If I click on the Chinese flag, you'll notice that the entire page is translated into Mandarin Chinese. Titles, actions, data, labels, and even the filters. If I open up one of the orders, you'll see even the record form has been completely translated, down to its buttons. Not even I can read this because I can't read Chinese. If I want to change it back to English, I'll hit the American flag widget and everything's back. It's pretty nifty. So, how was I able to translate my app between English and Chinese? Thankfully, Django makes it pretty easy with their out-of-the-box, batteries included, translation framework. Let's learn how to use it. The workflow for making translations in Django apps is a 4-step process. Some of the steps take a little bit more time than others. The first 2 are pretty simple. First, we need to add specific application settings to enable translations. Second, we need to add proper routing so that URLs will load pages with the appropriate locale. The third step is probably the most work-intensive, and that's marking all the visible strings in the application for translation. And I mean every single string that appears to the user. Fourth and finally, we need to provide
the translations themselves and compile them into language files. Everything I'll talk about today is documented on the Django docs page. So if you get stuck with translations on your own, I strongly recommend you do a quick search on the official docs because they're very helpful. Before we dig deep into each of those 4 steps, let's define our terms so that we know what we're talking about. The term token or string refers to a string of text to be translated in the application. It can be located either in the Python app code or in the Django templates. The term translation refers to a mapping of those strings from one language to another. In the case of my Django application, I wrote all of my strings in English as my primary language, and then I provided translations from English into Mandarin Chinese. The term localization, which is also abbreviated to L10N, refers to adapting an application for a locale. Now, a locale is a target region, and it includes not only language, but also other considerations, such as date formatting and even cultural considerations. Internationalization, or abbreviated as I18N, refers to the development work and tools that enable localization. So, internationalization could refer to, say, Django's translation framework, whereas localization would refer to the artifacts of that process, such as the language files for Chinese. Sometimes localization and internationalization are used interchangeably, but there is a nuance there, the difference between the framework and the artifacts. So I just want to make that clear before we continue. If we were to look at how our workflow separates between internationalization and localization, you could think of it this way. The first 3 steps, the app settings, the URL routing, and marking the strings, would all fall under internationalization, because those are things that the Django framework takes care of for you as tools and as process. Step 4, the compiling of language files themselves with their translations, would be considered localization, because they are targeting for that specific locale, whether that's American English or Mandarin Chinese, or any other language. Now, let's go through the 4 steps of our workflow, starting with application settings. All of the settings I'm about to show you will go into the Django project's settings.py file. First, I recommend adding the locale middleware to the list of middlewares. Locale middleware is not required, but it's very, very useful because it enables Django to automatically detect language preferences. If you add locale middleware, Django will then check for preference in this order. First, it'll check for URL language prefix. If that's not found, then it will check for a language cookie. If there's no language cookie, third, it will look for the accept language HTTP header in the request. And finally, if none of those 3 are found, then it will fall back on the default language set by language code in the settings file. The order of locale middleware is important. It needs to come after the session middleware because it uses the session. But it also needs to go before the common middleware because it uses URL prefixes. The next most important setting is the language code. Language code sets the default language for your Django app. In my case, the default language was American English. The format of language code must be an accept language HTTP header code. If you're not sure what those are, you can easily look them up online. The next settings enable translations and date formatting for locales. You want to set both use I18N and use L10N to be true. Note, if you know that your application won't do any translations, you could set both of these to false for a small performance boost. Next, I strongly recommend setting the languages setting. The list of languages given by this setting limits the available languages for translation. If you do not provide a list of languages here, then Django will potentially translate, or rather attempt to translate, any languages passed in by the user. So for example, in my application, I only have languages for English and Chinese. If a user were to try to translate my application into French, because I've set my languages here, they would receive an error. If I didn't set languages here, the app would attempt to translate the application into French. And most likely it would just display everything in English because there are no French locale files to be had. That would make the application look really bad and be a bit misleading. So it's always best to set the languages list so that only available languages can be done for translation. Finally, the last setting I recommend you set is the locale paths. Locale paths provides a list of directories for language files. If this is not specified, Django will look for a directory named quote-unquote locale in each application folder. However, in my experience, I find that I like to share my language translations across the entire application. And so for simplicity, I will create a directory named locale underneath my project base directory and put all of my locale files in there. And that's it for Django translation settings. It's pretty easy. Let's look at step 2, URLs. Language prefixes can indicate the desired language to load a page in directly in the URL. Notice the 3 URLs I have here. The first one has the language code for English prefixed onto the resource path for the page. This will load the page in English. My second one has ZH-Hans as the language code. That's the language code for simplified Chinese. That should load the page in simplified Chinese. The third URL doesn't have a language prefix, and by default, that should load my default language. For my case is English. Configuring URL language prefix routing is pretty straightforward. In your urls.py file, import the I18N patterns function from Django conf urls I18N. In your list of paths, simply wrap those paths with the I18N patterns function. You'll specify the list of paths in the same way you would otherwise. Finally, we'll need to add one more setting at the bottom so that the default language will be used whenever no prefix is specified. So we'll set prefix default language equals false. With the first 2 steps of our workflow done, let's move on to the third, strings. This will be probably the most work-intensive one. As I mentioned before, every publicly visible string will need to be marked for translation, whether that's in Python code or in Django templates. To mark strings for translation in Python code, we will need to use the getText function from Django utils translation. Here, I've shown the import, and as common practice, I've aliased it as a single underscore character. You'll see that pretty frequently because it's much shorter to type a single underscore than to type out the getText function every single time. Here, I also have an example view where I'm returning some output, and I've wrapped that output with my getText function. This will immediately translate this string from the primary language into whatever appropriate secondary language whenever it's executed. There's also a second translation function called getText_lazy. This function does lazy translations. Lazy translations are done when the string is accessed in context, such as when it is displayed or viewed, not when the translation function is called within the Python code. Lazy translations are needed for cases like models. So here's an example of a model called myThing, and I've lazily translated things like the name field, the help text, and some of the metadata. If you attempt to use the getText function instead of the getTextLazy function for these translations, it won't work. And you'll end up making the mistake I did, pulling my hair out for about an hour trying to figure out why the translations aren't working. Don't do that. Use lazy translations for models. Just like for the getText function, getText_lazy is often aliased with an underscore. To translate strings in Django templates, use the trans tag. You can translate either string literals or variable expressions. Just be careful with variable expressions because they might not get picked up when trying to compile message files. If you want to prepare translations for the future but skip them in the present, you can tack on the no-op word. That way, the strings will be left in the original language no matter what. You can also do block translations in Django templates. And block translations can even have placeholders, such as trying to substitute a value in for the string. You can also translate the admin site, like I did for my Django app. Here's some advice that I learned the hard way. First of all, use lazy translations for all strings. Using lazy translations doesn't hurt, and it can protect you from making mistakes, especially with models. Second, note that admin templates already have translations for several languages. I think I was reading the release notes recently that they just added the Uzbek language, which is pretty cool. Third, when trying to translate fields for apps and models, make sure to provide translations for the verbose name field and not the name field. Trying to translate the name field can cause some unexpected behavior and errors. Fourth, to keep your site looking pristine and clean, make sure to provide translations for titles, such as admin site index title, site header, and site title. If you want to learn more specifically about translating the Django admin, check out my blog post at automationpanda.com. There's a bit.ly link here. The fourth and final step to our translation workflow is compilation, meaning providing the translations for all those strings and compiling them into message files that Django can use. The first step is to make the message files. Message files will hold the translations for all the strings in the application. To create message files, run this command from the command line. Python manage.py, make messages, and then with the -l option, provide the locale code for your target translation language. This command searches for all translatable strings in the Django application, in both the Python code and the Django templates. Then, it'll do one of two things. It will either create a new language file under the locale paths directory if no language file already exists, or it will add all the new tokens it found to the existing language file under locale paths. As a warning, this command needs a locale name, not a language code. Locale names and language codes are two different things. So, whereas the language code for simplified Chinese is lowercase zh-hans, the locale code is lowercase zh_k capital H, Hans. Don't make that mistake, because I lost about an hour on that one. The make messages command will generate .po files that are the message files or the language files for the target locale. An example of a message file is here on the right. You'll see that the first line for each string is a comment indicating where in the code that string came from. The message ID field is that target string. And the message string field is the translation for that string for the given locale. Now, someone will need to provide the correct translations. Django is not smart enough to automatically translate arbitrary strings into your desired language. So, when I was developing my application, I would write some code, I would regenerate my message files, and then I would ask my wife to provide translations for the new strings. It is possible to have some of these strings ignored when translating. Whenever a string is marked with hashtag for the comment, comma fuzzy, that means that Django may have known what the translation might be based on some similar phrasing, but it wasn't positive. And so you will need to manually go in there and inspect. Django will also ignore translations for any empty message string values. If you fail to provide an explicit translation, Django will simply leave the string untranslated. And finally, if there are any missing translations, such as a string that was marked using getText, but no entry was found in the messages file, that string will be left in its original language. Once translations are provided in those .po files, it's time to compile them so Django can use them. To compile the message files, run the following command: Python managepy compile messages. This command converts all of the .po files in all of the locale directories into .mo files that Django can use. The .mo language files must be treated like any other static assets, just like HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and image files. And that four-step process is how we translate Django apps. It's not too difficult. It's just a bit of grind work. So now let's look at the big picture. Why is it important to translate apps? There's some big points to be made here. First, translations should bring people together. I know this firsthand very well. Growing up, my father was a world language teacher. He taught Spanish and German in Baltimore County. As an adult, I live in a family where we speak English, Chinese, and Chinglish. And so translations and understanding of language is very, very important for us to stay connected as a family. And it's also important in the software world because not all of our users may be using English as their first or any language. So we need translations to help bridge those gaps and bring people together. Second, I hope you can see with our four-step workflow, the translations are fairly easy to implement. They're just tedious. You've got to put in the settings and the URL prefixes, and then you have to grind through marking and translating every string. But there's nothing terribly challenging about it, especially when you have a good internationalization framework like Django does. Furthermore, I hope it's evident that it would be easier to start translating applications from the beginning of their development rather than after they've been in development for a while. Third, you might be wondering how AI could help with translations. And certainly it could. AI and machine learning might be able to help provide translations for message files. However, we would still want a human to kind of proofread to make sure that the translations make sense. I would guess that AI and machine learning could probably get it right about 80, 90, 95% of the time, and there may be just a few cases for things like slang or things that need greater context for a human to come in and kind of smooth out the edges. Fourth, you may be wondering about just-in-time translations. For example, if you use Google Chrome as your web browser and you navigate to a page from a different country, most likely Chrome will ask you if you want to translate the page into your native language. And it will do a just-in-time translation of all of the text that you see. That'll get you most of the way, but you've probably noticed that not every word or phrase is perfectly translated. You can figure it out, but you know it's not entirely smooth. So that's why I would say not all apps can or should use just-in-time translations like that. There are certainly cases that will always be true in which you want an application to have preset translations, such as the ones that Django provides, so that you can always have an accurate translation displayed. Furthermore, just-in-time translations do take extra time and execution to do, because it needs to call some other service on the fly and cram through a bunch of arbitrary strings. Whereas the pattern we see in the Django framework using static translation files, even though there is a bit of a time hit to load that new translation, it's still right there. It's already been decided. On a more serious note, translators have an ethical duty to make correct, accurate translations. People need translations to access information in other languages that they would otherwise have no access to. And it is absolutely important that translators are truthful and correct when they do translations. Here is an unfortunate example of mistranslation regarding the current coronavirus pandemic. This image went viral on Chinese social media back in February of this year, along with several others like it. The image shows a CNN headline about the first coronavirus case in the United States that did not have a traceable point of origin. This would be known as community spread. The headline is clear and straightforward for anyone who knows English. However, this image was circulated with the Chinese translation in yellow at the top. The Chinese translation reads, CDC of the USA admitted the first case of coronavirus originated in the United States. That is an obvious mistranslation. Unfortunately, the vast majority of people in China who saw this image probably didn't know English and were likely fooled by the mistranslation. Even more sadly, this is just one example of a massive misinformation campaign about the coronavirus happening in China right now. This mistranslation was almost assuredly deliberate, not accidental. All that to say, as Pythonistas, we bear a moral responsibility to use all technology ethically, even something as seemingly mundane or innocuous as translations. And that's my talk about Django translations. I hope you all have gotten a lot of value out of it. So, feel free to follow me on Twitter at AutomationPanda, or read my blog at automationpanda.com, and have fun doing those translations. Thank you.